what I'd like to talk about right now is a section that I think is very important to all aspects in libraries. And it is one that I like to bring up early as a topic to discuss because as we talk about them, they're going to be very used. As a matter of fact, our first assignment is going to be based on what we often call a needs assessment or a user study. But the user study is what you do. Needs assessment tends to be the document that is produced from the user study. So let's talk about these, and I will cover some aspects. We may talk about more of these in the discussion, but I hope I give you a good feel for user studies. Now, user studies are important because what they are is they're several steps that are used towards developing the collection for the library. It would seem that a simple step would be to purchase specifically books and materials for the library. But that is just one step that is a reflection of what the users want or what the users need. And so understanding the library's users, in a public library, it could be the community. In a university, it would be the faculty and students. In a school library, it would be the teachers and the students. So whoever is the user of the library, it helps to understand who they are. Running in an academic institution, I needed to know the faculty individually. I had to know who they were and what they wanted, and by corollary, what the grad students wanted. So I'd know what to get on the professorial side of the coin. When it came to the students, then I had to be a little bit broader, a little bit more simplistic than what the professors would want. But as a result, you would develop a large collection that could be used by both professors and grad students and undergraduate students. Regardless of who it is, understanding the users of a library is necessary as a first step in developing a good collection. So, what you need to do is first you need to consider in this process of what does the community need. When I say community need, it could be what the community needs, it could be what the community wants. But realistically, what do they need? You may need public library. The vast majority of users may need something, but the minority, those who don't use the library a lot, may also need things, and they may not necessarily be the same things as the library user uses. So when you're talking about a community in a public library, you're not talking necessarily about the people who use the library, but all the people in the community. So when you talk about a community, you're not talking about just the library users, you're talking about everybody in the community. What a needs assessment helps to do is develop a collection development policy, which is also a written document and also one that we will use a little bit later in the course. Have everyone work on developing a collection development policy. A collection development policy says after you've done the needs assessment, you develop a collection development policy, and a collection development policy informs people what is going to be bought. And then there's also the methods in purchasing. How does the library purchase? Does it purchase from Amazon or different locations? How does the library go about buying books and things? When it does buy the book, there's the inherent classification. Does the book come pre-cataloged or not? Do you catalog internally in the institution, or does the book come to the library with cataloging information? How does the library catalog material for the shelf? Does it use Dewey? use Library of Congress, and there's a number of libraries that are starting to use BSAC, which is the bookstore methodology. I do have links. Hopefully you can pause this enough to be able to go through the links as you need to. One is a link to the BSAC, and then another one is just a Wikipedia about library classification, kind of giving you an overview of classification. And then the other part is this collection assessment. After you purchase the material, is it correct for later, or was it purchased in error in that it was bought thinking it would be used and not used? And then finally, what is generally referred to as weeding, or also known as deselection, which is removing books from a collection that are not being used. So consider these things. These things will help as you develop what a community needs. If you know what the library does, you can then look at the community and see how all these things pull into place. So, what a user study is a part of collection development. And the methods that are used for a user study are similar regardless of the type of library, being at an academic library, public library, corporate library. You may have a different type of community for an academic library versus a public library, and certainly different also as well for corporate libraries, for example. Could be prison libraries, school libraries, doesn't really matter. I'm just saying the methods are roughly the same. Well, as I said, in user study, the first step is to learn what the patron wants or needs. And wants and needs are not always the same thing. Patrons may say they want something, but when they actually go use a library, what they get is something completely different. So wants and needs have to be considered. That's one of the things that happen in the reference interview, is you determine what a person actually needs. They tell you what they want, but sometimes what they want is not what they need. And the reference question brings that out. Sometimes a person will tell you what they think they want you to hear, or what they think you should hear, and it's not actually what they want. For example, taking a public library, most patrons want bestsellers. But then you also have to have a selection of classics to meet student users. There used to be a librarian in Baltimore, the director, who said, give them what they want. And the idea would be you would buy things for the library that people wanted. But I would argue that what you buy for the library, that what people want, may not be everything that you need in the library. Library needs to collect for everyone. You may have collection classics that circulate infrequently, but you still need to have them. And then, again, the user study ultimately ends with a document that's called a need or needs assessment. Sometimes I'll say needs assessment, sometimes I'll say needs assessment. They're the same thing. You could use needs as a plural, or you could use needs as a possessive. And then a user study looks at everyone in the community and determines by that what each group wants or needs for the collection. Now, when it comes to user assessments, or what you're studying, you could be working on an assessment for the entire library, or you could be working on an assessment for a specific collection within the library. For example, a youth librarian might want to know what the needs and uses are for teens, and they might want to also know what the needs and uses are for children, depending on who the youth librarian is. The director might want to know everything, might want to know not only children's interests, but also adult interests. So a good user assessment is going to look at what you're trying to determine, the overall collection or part of the collection, and then studying it from that aspect. Now, everyone's interests are different, and therefore the collections are different. If you consider a children's collection, you might have more print materials than an adult collection. and a collection at a university. I did collect chemistry at one university where I never did get books on what's referred to as a selection process, a vendor, an approval process that we'll talk about a little bit later. And it was because they didn't accept illustrations, and there are very few chemistry books that do not have illustrations. Therefore, almost no books were received at that time. Everyone's different. So as you do a user assessment, I'm going to operate under the assumption that you're going to do the entire library. There are some situations where a group may decide, because this ultimately the user assessment is part of the needs assessment and is part of the group assignment that we will use in the class. Now, how to study users. This is a very interesting concept in itself. There are several methods that you can use, and most are used together. There are demographics, where the people live and different things, and that can be found through predominantly census materials and school sites. In other words, you might say in a public library, you might say use the census materials to realize who the people are, income and income levels, education levels, different things that you might need in the census. Usually what I'm looking at, if I was in a public library, I would be looking at incomes, I would be looking at education, and ages are primarily the main things that you look at. There are some other things that can be useful depending on what you're doing, but ages, families, single household families, double household families, different types of people, how they live, what their education is, their income levels, and different things. Now, when you're talking about school sites, you might be looking at does the school get students from different areas outside of the community for a public library? Is it getting students from particular age ranges for that particular school? Like a high school 9 through 12, but a middle school is lesser than. And when you look at a school site, you might be looking at who the parents are, or who the children are, who the teachers are. Many times with schools and universities and such, you're using a combination of phone calls and websites to get that type of information. Schools and universities often have either on the web or on a specific person who knows that type of information. Universities, more than anyone, will often give that type of information on the web. Another thing that you need to consider are surveys, print surveys, different types of programs like SurveyMonkey, Google Forms. I've used all of them, but mostly I've used SurveyMonkey or Google Forms. And then, of course, there's focus groups. Focus groups are where you ask questions of users, and you can do them either at the library, or you might do another location, or you might, for specific people, you might meet them in the office. Focus groups can vary from large groups to small groups. Next thing you need to do is start by determining what it is you need to know. What would I like to know by asking these questions? I'm not going to do a survey unless I have a good idea of what I want to learn from the survey. I'm not going to do a focus group unless I know what kind of questions to ask members of the focus group. Start by determining what it is you think you need to know, and then choose the method, demographic surveys or focus groups, based on what you need to learn. What I'm going to recommend is that you use all three. But sometimes, for a specific reason, you may only use one or two of them and not all of them. You may have a good idea of the demographics, but you may hit a specific case where you want to survey something specific. I know one library did a survey using SurveyMonkey where they surveyed everybody for everything. And then later, I mean, it was a fairly massive survey to get a lot of answers. But then later, they wanted to know very specifically something about the catalog. Should we do this or that? And so they'll do a SurveyMonkey questionnaire, which is only 2 questions. Do you like this one or do you like that one? And then they would do 2 screenshots of, say, a catalog page. The way they have it synced now and the way they think they'd like to sync it. And so they will show 2 pages and they'll say, do you like this one or this one? So start by determining what you want to know and then choose the methods by which you need to learn it or you think you can learn it. And you may change your mind. You may start with a survey and then decide to go with the focus group. Now, when it comes to demographics, there are 2 big ones. One is census materials, and the other one is a program called Esri. Whether you use census materials or Esri, capturing the data, particularly using an Excel file, is extremely useful. Because with Excel, you may be able to get information on the census, but you might want to be able to graph it in a slightly different manner. You might want to be able to visualize the numbers using a table. You might want to use a pie chart or something of that nature. And you may capture the data and then run it through Excel to, say, create a pie chart or to use the numbers in a greater fashion. Determine questions when you do the census, things like education, wealth, age of the population, and different kinds of data. Now, when it comes to schools and universities, things of those nature, their websites can be usable for looking at those types of demographics. Now, when it comes to census, you get the current information pretty much by using the census.gov/data that I've got linked here. For any reason, if you need older information, probably not for a user study, but maybe for something else you're doing, there are a couple locations, myheritage.com and ancestry.com. Libraries often get ancestry.com in what's called the library version. It's a little bit more, less information than the full ancestry version, but it's accessible to libraries. I have used older information to locate death records. The other program that you can use is one that generally costs. It's called Esri. It does have a section that does like a zip code lookup that can be useful to give you some information. When you use Esri, it does a little bit different than the census, and what it does is it provides community information that some of it is in the census and some of it is not, or is done in a different fashion. So what I would recommend is that you primarily rely on census materials, but also realize that there is a program called Esri, which gives you some additional information that you don't normally find in the census. It's basically a GPS type program. Esri is. Another one that can be useful is maps, like Google Map or any type of mapping system. It is handy, particularly when you're looking at, for example, a public library, to know where the people live. And by using a map, you can actually identify the areas where people are that use the library. Maybe they're convenient to getting to the library and less convenient to getting to the library. After you examine these things, you may realize that suddenly you need a branch library that you weren't planning to have to be able to connect to a specific population. So varying mapping programs like Google or any other, I mentioned Google, but any mapping program can be of use to determining the community. Now, surveying users can be done in multiple manners. You can do print surveys, you can use SurveyMonkey, you can do a variety of Google Forms that goes into a Google spreadsheet. Surveys can be lengthy or short, but often short is better. The reason I say lengthy or short, and short is better, is because when you're asking somebody to fill out a survey, you're more apt to get answers on short surveys than you are on lengthy surveys. So survey writing is a very intensive type document that takes a little bit of expertise in doing, but I will tell you that shorter tends to be better. Most people don't want to fill out anything more than necessary. Now, there's also a talent in being able to write a short survey using radio buttons and short sentences when possible. And I would tell you that using electronic, like SurveyMonkey, Google Forms, are good ways to get a survey out electronically. People tend to use things like smartphones to fill out surveys that they wouldn't normally do on a computer or in print. There is a problem with surveys. Survey is very strong, but the problem with the survey is distribution. For example, you cannot use the library's catalog. You have to use other methods. Using the library's catalog is not only unethical, it's often illegal. It's unethical because patron records are for borrowing and not to be used for other things. It's illegal in some states where there's a privacy law. For example, in the state of Michigan, there is an act called 455 of 1982. I've got a link to the Michigan one that basically states that in this state, or in Michigan, if you violate a patron record for any reason, you can be fined $200 minimum up to the cost of the actual damage, which means for every record. So say you did a survey of 100 records, you could potentially be liable for $200 times, your records. It's just a lot of money. So it is better not to use patron records for developing a survey. What you can do is you can put a survey in a newspaper with a short link to it, and then you look at things like, does the library use electronic newsletter, like web page, Facebook's, Twitter's. You can use those to put out a survey. If you have links to various schools, churches, and different organizations within the community, you could use those as well. Now, a focus group is very useful. Basically, you're getting a bunch of people together and you're having a list of questions that you want the answers to, and you talk to them and try to get them to answer the questions. You create a discussion to learn the community and what do they want and need. You can do this in a variety of ways. You can bring them into the library, like you could have a coffee hour kind of thing. Drinks and donuts, and have them come to the library and do the focus group within the library. You could go to a community organization and do a focus group at a community organization, Rotary Club, something of that nature, or even any number of different types of community organizations. You could go to a meeting of the township or city in a public library. You could go to the school board meeting. You could go to set up a meeting at the school to do this as well. Determine what you need, to determine the questions that you want to ask, and to whom you can go for the groups. Where do you want to get, when you do a focus group, it might not be a specific group. It might be an individual, like the city treasurer. It might be a professor. It could be a group of professors. You meet at a time when they're all together and you ask them. But when you have a focus group, you should have an idea of what is it you want to learn and the questions that you would ask of that group to get the information that is necessary for you to have. Now, mind you, many of the groups tend to be conversations, but it is wise to have a series of questions that you're going to ask every member in the groups, in all the groups, the same questions, so that the answers, while they may vary, are always answers to the same questions. You can also do focus groups not just by in person, you could also do them by phone. A lot of times institutions will contract with a secondary company for a user study, not do it internally, but do it, hire someone to do it. And a lot of those will use phone questionnaires. Now remember, you can always ask me any questions you have. You can use the virtual office or send me an email. As I talk about user studies, we'll talk about them perhaps a little bit more in the discussions, but user studies are going to be critical for working on the first group assignment. Again, thank you very much.